Laura Thompson stood at the kitchen sink, gazing out of the window into their perfectly manicured backyard. The summer sun was shining brightly, casting long shadows from the trees. Emma and Ryan were playing on the swing set, their laughter carried into the house by the breeze. It was a scene that could have been pulled from any family magazine. Two children playing happily, a beautiful home, and a mother who seemed to have it all. But inside, Laura felt a growing emptiness. She glanced at the clock. Daniel would be home late again. He was always late these days, caught up in his demanding job as a regional manager for a logistics company. He had started this position about a year ago, and while it provided a good income for their family, it had also begun to steal Daniel away from her. He traveled constantly, working late hours even when he was home, glued to his laptop or on the phone with clients. Laura tried to understand, but the distance between them had been growing, bit by bit, with each passing day. 11 years of marriage, and now, it felt like they were more roommates than husband and wife. Laura couldn't remember the last time they had truly connected, truly spoken about something that mattered. Their conversations were mostly transactional these days, discussing Emma and Ryan's school schedules, what needed to be picked up from the grocery store, who would handle the upcoming PTA meeting or soccer game. And the nights. The nights had grown lonelier than she ever thought possible. Daniel often fell asleep on the couch, exhausted from work, while Laura lay awake in their bedroom, staring at the ceiling, wondering when everything had started to fall apart. It wasn't as if she didn't love him anymore. She did. She loved the man she had built a life with. She loved the father of her children. But the intimacy, the emotional connection, was gone, leaving an aching void that Laura didn't know how to fill. As she turned away from the window, her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from Kyle Roberts, their neighbor from across the street. Kyle, hey, I'm going to mow the lawn later. I can take care of yours too if you want. Laura smiled despite herself. Kyle had always been generous with his time. He had moved into the neighborhood 3 years ago after his divorce, and over time, they had grown close as neighbors and friends. He was charming in a rugged, down-to-earth way, a contractor who worked with his hands. He'd often offered to help with small repairs around the house, things that Daniel would have done if he had the time. Laura quickly typed a reply. Laura, that would be great, Kyle. Thanks. You don't have to, though. A moment later, her phone buzzed again. Kyle, I don't mind. Besides, it gives me something to do. See you later. Laura put her phone down, trying to ignore the slight flutter in her chest. It wasn't unusual for Kyle to offer help. It was just his nature. But lately, Laura found herself looking forward to their interactions a little more than she should. He was easy to talk to, someone who seemed to truly listen, something that had become rare in her marriage. And he understood her in ways that Daniel, caught up in his career, no longer did. Later that afternoon, Kyle arrived as promised, pushing his lawnmower across the Thompsons' yard. Laura came out onto the porch, holding a glass of iced tea for him as he finished up. Thanks again, she called out over the hum of the mower. Kyle shut it off and walked over to her, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. No problem. It was overdue anyway, he said, flashing her a grin. They stood on the porch for a moment, sipping their drinks and chatting about the neighborhood. It was easy to talk to Kyle, their conversations flowing naturally. Over time, their chats had become longer, more personal. Laura had confided in him about her frustrations with Daniel's absence, her growing loneliness, and her struggles as a mother. Kyle had shared stories from his divorce, the difficulties of starting over, and the loneliness he felt living alone. I don't know what happened between us, Laura admitted quietly that afternoon, her voice tinged with sadness. Daniel and I, we used to be so close, but now, it feels like we're just going through the motions. Kyle listened, his eyes soft with understanding. I know how that feels, he said gently, being with someone but still feeling alone. It's tough. Laura sighed, feeling the weight of her emotions. She hadn't meant to open up like this, but Kyle had a way of making her feel heard, like her feelings mattered. He was attentive in a way Daniel hadn't been in years. As they talked, a subtle tension grew between them. Laura could feel it, an unspoken connection that hadn't been there before. She knew she should go back inside, break the moment before it went too far. But she didn't move. She didn't want to. The silence between them grew, heavy with possibility. And then, before she knew what was happening, Kyle leaned in, and their lips met. The kiss was soft at first, almost tentative. Laura's heart raced in her chest, her mind screaming at her to stop, to pull away, but her body betrayed her. The kiss deepened, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to get lost in the sensation. It was intoxicating, thrilling, a rush of emotions she hadn't felt in years. But reality came crashing down a second later. Laura pulled back, her breath ragged, her eyes wide with shock. I'm sorry, she stammered, standing up from the porch swing. I shouldn't have. This was a mistake. Kyle looked just as shocked, his face a mixture of confusion and regret. Laura, wait. But she didn't wait. She rushed inside, her mind spinning. What had she just done? She had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. That night, Laura lay in bed, her thoughts racing. She felt sick with guilt, ashamed of what had happened. And yet, deep down, she couldn't deny the spark that had ignited between her and Kyle. She had tried to ignore it, tried to pretend it wasn't there. But now, after that kiss, there was no denying it. She hadn't felt alive like that in years. The days that followed were tense and awkward. Laura avoided Kyle as much as possible, keeping her distance and making sure the children were always with her when she was outside. She threw herself into her responsibilities, trying to act normal, trying to forget what had happened. But she couldn't forget. Kyle, to his credit, didn't push. He respected her space, even though Laura could feel his eyes on her whenever they happened to be outside at the same time. There was a silent understanding between them, a recognition that they had crossed a line but were too unsure of what to do next. Weeks passed, and Laura tried to push the incident out of her mind. She focused on her family, on the kids, on keeping up with the endless demands of daily life. But something had changed. The spark she had felt with Kyle had ignited something inside her, something she had thought was long dead. And now, she couldn't stop thinking about him. The guilt weighed heavily on her, but so did the loneliness she felt at home. Daniel was more distant than ever, his work taking precedence over everything else. He would come home late, exhausted, and barely speak to her before falling asleep on the couch. They lived in the same house, but it felt like they were miles apart. Laura felt like a ghost in her own marriage, going through the motions of daily life, but never truly being present. She knew she needed to talk to Daniel, to tell him how she was feeling, but every time she tried, something held her back. Maybe it was fear. Fear that he wouldn't care, fear that he wouldn't change, fear that things were too broken to fix. Then, one afternoon, everything changed. Laura had been feeling off for a few days, nauseous, tired, and just not herself. She chalked it up to stress, but when her period was late, she couldn't ignore the possibility that something else might be going on. Reluctantly, she bought a pregnancy test. She didn't really think she was pregnant, but the nagging thought wouldn't go away. She needed to be sure. When the test turned positive, Laura's world came crashing down. She stared at the 2 pink lines, her hand trembling as the reality of the situation hit her like a ton of bricks. Pregnant. She was pregnant. But how? She and Daniel had only been intimate once in the past month, and it didn't align with when she had conceived. She wasn't pregnant with Daniel's child. The baby was Kyle's. Laura sank onto the edge of the bathtub, her mind racing. How could this be happening? She had only kissed Kyle once. They hadn't slept together. Had they? No, it wasn't possible. But as her mind churned over the last few months, she realized the full weight of what she had done. The emotions, the feelings she had allowed to bloom with Kyle, had left her vulnerable. She wasn't sure how to tell Daniel. The thought of it made her stomach turn. He didn't deserve this. He didn't deserve to be lied to. But he also didn't deserve to know the truth. How could she destroy everything they had built? And Kyle, what was she supposed to do about him? Should she tell him? Could she keep this secret from him forever? Laura's mind spun with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. There was no escaping the truth. She was pregnant with her neighbor's child, and her marriage, her life, was about to unravel. But for now, she needed time to think. Time to figure out what to do next. Time to figure out how to live with the lie. The next morning, Laura woke up with a heavy pit in her stomach, the reality of the pregnancy sinking in like a lead weight. She lay in bed for a while, staring at the ceiling, trying to summon the energy to face the day. The positive pregnancy test still sat in the drawer of the bathroom vanity, hidden from sight but not from her thoughts. It was the first time she had kept something so monumental from Daniel. The guilt gnawed at her, but alongside the guilt was fear. Paralyzing fear. She couldn't bring herself to imagine his face when he learned the truth, the hurt that would follow. But she also couldn't keep this hidden forever. The clock was ticking, and her growing belly would soon tell the truth for her if she didn't act first. As she lay there, she thought back to when she and Daniel had first started dating. He had been so attentive, so loving. Back then, she had never doubted his affection for her. But life had happened. Work, children, the daily grind. And somehow, they had drifted apart without even realizing it. And now, they were standing on opposite sides of an ever-widening chasm, with no clear way back to each other. But this secret had the potential to break them apart forever. Laura finally forced herself out of bed, the weight of the secret pressing down on her with every step. She went through the motions of the morning, getting Emma and Ryan ready for school, packing their lunches, and waving them off as they climbed into the carpool. She smiled at them, kissed them on the cheek, and wished them a good day, all the while feeling like she was suffocating inside her own life. As soon as the kids were gone, the house fell into an eerie silence. Normally, Laura found solace in these quiet hours, a break from the chaos of motherhood. But today, the quiet felt oppressive, wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. She couldn't avoid it any longer. She needed to talk to Kyle. Laura sat in her car for a long time before she gathered the courage to text Kyle. Her hands trembled as she typed, her mind racing with uncertainty. "Laura, can we talk? It's important." Her thumb hovered over the send button for what felt like an eternity, her heart pounding in her chest. She hesitated, knowing that once she sent the message, there would be no going back. She would have to face Kyle, face the truth, and start unraveling the mess she had created. Finally, with a deep breath, she hit send. The response came quickly. "Kyle, of course. I'll be home all day. Come over whenever you're ready." Later that afternoon, Laura found herself standing on Kyle's porch, her nerves frayed. She knocked lightly, and after a moment, the door swung open to reveal Kyle. His face lit up when he saw her, though his smile faltered when he noticed her expression. "Laura," he said, his tone concerned. "What's wrong?" She stepped inside, her heart racing. "We need to talk." Kyle led her to the living room, where they sat down on the couch. Laura felt the weight of the moment hanging in the air between them, suffocating her. She hadn't planned how to tell him, hadn't rehearsed the words. They just spilled out of her in a rush. "I'm pregnant." Kyle froze, his eyes widening as the words sank in. He blinked, his expression shifting from confusion to shock. You're pregnant?" Laura nodded, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "Yes, and it's yours, Kyle." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Kyle stared at her, his face pale, as if trying to process what she had just said. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "Are you sure?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Laura nodded again, tears welling up in her eyes. "Yes, I'm sure." The silence that followed was unbearable. Kyle stood up, running a hand through his hair as he paced the room. "Jesus, Laura. I didn't plan this," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "It was a mistake. We were a mistake. But now I don't know what to do." Kyle stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression conflicted. "Does Daniel know?" Laura shook her head, wiping away the tears that had begun to fall. "No, I haven't told him yet. I don't even know how to tell him. It'll destroy him." Kyle sank onto the couch beside her, his head in his hands. "I don't know what to say, Laura. I didn't think things would get this far. I thought we could just move past that night, pretend it never happened. But now—" "I know," Laura whispered, her voice breaking. "I thought the same thing. But we can't undo this." Kyle was quiet for a long moment, his face a mixture of guilt, fear, and something else, something Laura couldn't quite place. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with regret. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I don't know," Laura admitted, her hands trembling. "I can't tell Daniel. I can't destroy my family, but I can't lie to him either. I need time to figure it out." Kyle nodded, though his expression was filled with worry. "Whatever you decide, I'll be here. I'm not going to walk away from this. I want to help." Laura didn't know what to say. She appreciated Kyle's offer of support, but the truth was, she wasn't sure if she wanted his help. She wasn't even sure what she wanted anymore. All she knew was that her life had spiraled out of control, and she had no idea how to fix it. "I need time," she whispered, standing up from the couch. "I'll let you know what I decide." Kyle watched her leave, his face pale and drawn. As Laura stepped out into the cool afternoon air, she felt a sense of dread settle deep in her chest. She couldn't keep this secret forever. The next few days passed in a blur. Laura went through the motions of her life, trying to keep up appearances for the sake of the children. She attended PTA meetings, took the kids to soccer practice, and hosted playdates, all while carrying the crushing weight of her secret. Every time she looked at Daniel, her stomach churned with guilt. He was still distant, still consumed by his work, but he didn't deserve what was happening behind his back. Each night, Laura lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with possibilities. Should she tell Daniel? Should she lie? Every option seemed impossible. The thought of seeing the hurt in his eyes when he found out the truth was unbearable, but so was the idea of living a lie for the rest of her life. The only person she could talk to was Kyle, but even that felt wrong. She didn't want to drag him further into this mess, and yet, she felt like he was the only one who understood the weight of her decision. One evening, as Laura was preparing dinner, Daniel came home earlier than usual. She was standing at the stove, stirring a pot of pasta sauce, when she heard the sound of his footsteps behind her. She turned, surprised to see him there. "Hey," she said, her voice shaky. "You're home early." Daniel nodded, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, I finished up at the office sooner than expected." He didn't say anything else as he set down his briefcase and loosened his tie. Laura could feel the tension in the air between them, thick and heavy. She turned back to the stove, hoping to avoid a conversation. But Daniel didn't let it go. "You've been different lately," he said, his voice quiet but pointed. Laura's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Daniel walked over to the counter, leaning against it as he watched her. "I mean, you've been distant. You've been acting strange for weeks now. What's going on, Laura?" She froze, her hand gripping the spoon tighter. This was it. This was the moment she had been dreading. She started, her voice faltering. "I've just been tired, that's all. The kids, they've been a lot lately." Daniel didn't seem convinced. "Is there something you're not telling me?" Laura felt her stomach drop. She couldn't do this. She couldn't tell him. Not like this. "No," she said quickly, turning off the stove. "I'm just stressed, that's all." Daniel stared at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers for any sign of the truth. Finally, he sighed and pushed away from the counter. "Okay, but if there's something you want to talk about, you can tell me." "I know," Laura whispered, her heart aching with the weight of the lie. But she didn't tell him. She couldn't. Not yet. The next morning, Laura woke up feeling nauseous. At first, she thought it was just the stress, but as the days passed, the nausea grew worse. She could no longer ignore the physical signs of her pregnancy. The fatigue, the constant exhaustion, the growing tightness in her clothes. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror one morning, her hand resting on her abdomen. There was no denying it now. Her body was changing, and soon, it would be impossible to hide. She had to make a decision. Fast. But no matter which path she chose, her life would never be the same. A few days later, as Laura was dropping the kids off at school, her phone buzzed with a message from Kyle. "Kyle, we need to talk. Please." Laura stared at the message, her stomach twisting with anxiety. She had been avoiding him since their last conversation, unsure of what to say. But Kyle was right. They couldn't avoid this forever. With a sigh, she typed a response. "Laura, I'll stop by later tonight after the kids are in bed." The rest of the day passed in a blur of anxiety. Laura went through the motions, picking up groceries, cooking dinner, helping Emma with her homework, but her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about what she was going to say to Kyle, about the decision she needed to make. After the kids were finally asleep and Daniel was in his home office finishing up work, Laura slipped out of the house and made her way to Kyle's. Her heart pounded with every step, and by the time she knocked on his door, her hands were shaking. Kyle answered almost immediately, his face tense. He stepped aside to let her in, and Laura hesitated for a moment before walking past him into the living room. "We can't keep avoiding this," Kyle said, his voice filled with urgency. "What are we going to do?" Laura didn't know how to answer him. She stood there, her arms wrapped around herself, trying to keep the tears at bay. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice shaking. "I don't know what to do." Kyle walked over to her, his expression softening. "I want to help, Laura. I don't want you to go through this alone." "I'm not ready to tell Daniel," she said quickly, her voice tight with fear. "I don't know how to tell him. He'll never forgive me." Kyle took a deep breath, his face etched with concern. "Then don't tell him. At least, not yet. Maybe we can figure something out, a way to deal with this without destroying everything." Laura looked at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You think I can hide this? For how long? The truth will come out eventually, Kyle. It always does." Kyle ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated. I don't want to lose you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken emotion. "You haven't lost me," Laura said softly, though she wasn't sure if it was true. She had already lost so much, her sense of stability, her peace of mind. And now, her marriage was on the verge of collapse. "I need more time," she whispered, stepping back. "I'll figure something out. I just need time." Kyle nodded, though his expression was filled with uncertainty. "Take all the time you need." As Laura left Kyle's house that night, she felt the weight of the decision she needed to make pressing down on her like a boulder. There was no easy way out of this. Whatever choice she made, someone would get hurt. And no matter what, her life would never be the same again. As Laura walked back across the street to her house, the cool night air chilling her skin, she felt the full weight of her situation crashing down on her. She had tried for weeks to avoid the inevitable, to push the decision further and further away, hoping that somehow the right answer would present itself. But now, she knew there was no more time. She had to decide what to do. And there were no perfect choices, only painful ones. When Laura reached her front door, she paused for a moment, staring at the warm glow of the lights inside. Daniel was home, sitting in his office, completely unaware of the turmoil brewing within her. It was late, but she knew he would still be working, trying to finish up reports or emails for the next day. That was Daniel, dedicated, hardworking, and, lately, completely absorbed in his job. She used to admire that about him. Now, it felt like a wall between them. Taking a deep breath, Laura opened the door quietly and stepped inside. The house was still. The kids were asleep, and the only sound was the faint clicking of Daniel's keyboard from the other room. She walked slowly to the kitchen, her mind spinning with everything that had happened in the last few weeks: the pregnancy, the kiss with Kyle, the overwhelming sense of guilt that had consumed her ever since. She couldn't keep doing this. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was normal. She walked toward Daniel's office, her hands trembling. She knew what she had to do, but it didn't make it any easier. The truth was going to hurt. It was going to destroy everything she and Daniel had built together, but she couldn't live with the lies anymore. She had to face the consequences of her actions, no matter how painful they would be. Laura knocked softly on the door to Daniel's office, her heart racing in her chest. "Come in," Daniel called, his voice slightly muffled. She opened the door and stepped inside. Daniel was sitting at his desk, his eyes glued to the computer screen, but he glanced up when she entered. He frowned, noticing the look on her face. "Hey," he said, his tone curious but concerned. "What's going on?" Laura swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. "We need to talk," she whispered, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel's expression changed immediately. He turned off his computer screen and stood up, walking over to her. What is it? You look upset. She couldn't look him in the eye. Not yet. She needed to get the words out before she lost her nerve. Daniel, I've been keeping something from you, she said, her voice trembling. Something really important. Daniel's brow furrowed in confusion, but he didn't say anything. He just waited, his eyes searching her face for answers. I'm pregnant, Laura blurted out, the words spilling from her mouth in a rush. For a moment, Daniel looked confused. He blinked, his expression shifting as he tried to process what she had just said. Pregnant? He repeated, his voice uncertain. But how? Laura felt tears welling up in her eyes, and she forced herself to meet his gaze. It's not yours, she whispered, her voice breaking. I made a mistake, Daniel. A terrible mistake. The room fell into a deafening silence. Daniel stared at her, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock. For a moment, it looked like he didn't understand, like he couldn't comprehend what she was telling him. Then, slowly, the realization hit him. Who? He asked, his voice tight with barely suppressed emotion. Who is it? Laura wiped at the tears that were now streaming down her face. It's Kyle, she whispered. It only happened once, and it was a mistake. I never meant for this to happen. I never meant to hurt you. Daniel let out a bitter, disbelieving laugh. He turned away from her, running a hand through his hair as he paced the room. Kyle? Our neighbor? You're telling me you're pregnant with Kyle's baby? Laura nodded, her heart breaking as she watched the man she had loved for over a decade struggle to process the truth. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't mean to betray you. Daniel stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her. How long have you been keeping this from me? Laura's throat tightened. A few weeks, she admitted, her voice barely audible. I found out a few weeks ago, and I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to hurt you. Daniel's face twisted in anger and pain. You didn't want to hurt me? He repeated, his voice rising. You think hiding something like this would make it better? You've been lying to me, Laura. I can't even. He turned away again, pacing the room as he struggled to control his emotions. Laura stood there, frozen in place, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to fix the damage she had caused. I didn't know what to do, she said finally, her voice trembling. I didn't want to destroy our family. Daniel stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression filled with hurt. You've already destroyed it, he said quietly. There's nothing left to save. The words hit Laura like a punch to the gut. She had known this was coming, but hearing him say it aloud made the reality of it all so much worse. She had ruined everything, her marriage, her family, her life with Daniel, and there was no going back. I'm sorry, she whispered, the words feeling hollow. Daniel shook his head, his eyes filled with sadness. Sorry doesn't change anything, Laura. You've broken us. He took a deep breath, his voice calmer but still laced with pain. I can't stay here. I need time. I need to figure out what to do next. Laura nodded, tears falling freely now. I understand, she whispered. Without another word, Daniel turned and walked out of the room, leaving Laura standing there alone, her heart shattered into a million pieces. The days that followed were some of the hardest of Laura's life. Daniel moved out of the house, staying with a friend while he figured out how to move forward. He still saw the kids, still showed up for them, but his relationship with Laura was broken beyond repair. Their conversations were brief and filled with tension, and Laura knew that their marriage was over. Emma and Ryan could sense that something was wrong, though they didn't fully understand what was happening. They asked questions, why Daddy wasn't staying at home, why Mommy was always so sad. But Laura couldn't bring herself to explain. Not yet. She told them that Daddy needed some time, that everything would be okay, but deep down, she wasn't sure if it ever would be. Kyle reached out a few times, but Laura kept her distance. She couldn't handle talking to him right now, couldn't face the reality of what their mistake had cost her. She knew that Kyle wanted to be involved, that he wanted to help with the baby, but she wasn't ready to figure that out yet. She needed space to grieve the life she had lost. Months passed, and as Laura's pregnancy progressed, so did the inevitable changes in her life. She and Daniel filed for divorce. They agreed on a custody arrangement for Emma and Ryan. Daniel would have them on weekends, while Laura would continue to care for them during the week. Their once happy home was now a fractured shell of what it had been, and Laura couldn't help but feel responsible for the pain she had caused. But through it all, one thing remained constant: her love for her children. As her belly grew, she found herself bonding with the baby she hadn't planned for, the baby that had come from a moment of weakness but was still a part of her. She named her Lily, and as the months passed, she began to accept the fact that this child was her future, a symbol of the new life she would have to create. The day Lily was born was bittersweet. She held her newborn daughter in her arms, overwhelmed by love and sadness all at once. Lily was innocent in all of this, untouched by the mistakes that had led to her existence. And as Laura gazed down at her baby, she made a promise to herself and to Lily. No matter how difficult things became, she would protect her children. She would give them the best life she could, despite the mess her own life had become. The months after Lily's birth were filled with challenges, but also moments of quiet joy. Laura learned to navigate life as a single mother, balancing her responsibilities with Emma, Ryan, and the newborn. There were days when it all felt too overwhelming, when the weight of her choices pressed down on her. But there were also moments of hope, moments when she saw a future that wasn't defined by her mistakes, but by the love she had for her children. Daniel, while still distant, continued to be a good father to Emma and Ryan. Their relationship was strained, but they worked together for the sake of the kids. Laura knew that he would never forgive her, that their marriage would remain a painful memory for both of them, but she had come to accept that. As for Kyle, Laura eventually allowed him to be part of Lily's life. It wasn't easy, and their relationship was complicated, but Kyle was committed to being a father to Lily. They co-parented as best they could, though they both knew that their connection would never be more than that of two people bound by a single mistake. Life wasn't perfect, but it was moving forward. And in the quiet moments, when Laura sat with her children and watched them play, she felt a glimmer of peace. Her life hadn't turned out the way she had planned, but she had survived the storm, and now she was ready to rebuild, one day at a time. Subscribe to the channel and like this story if you liked it. Turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories. Click on the playlist on the right to listen to previous stories. See you soon.